All right, I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Marshall. My name is Teresa Fraser, and I'm a supporting member of the KHealth Student Interest Group at Queen's University. And on behalf of the KHealth team, I'm very excited to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Carrie Anne Marshall from Western University. She's an associate professor with the School of Occupational Therapy, and her research interests are in homelessness, poverty, mental health, and addiction. And she's got some wonderful information to share with us today. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming out. And thank you, Dr. Marshall, for being here with us today. I'm very excited.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for inviting me. So I'll start off by telling you kind of a little bit about why I'm presenting to you on this topic. So I'll just start sharing my slides with you. Should come up here. And it's on this kind of topic of thriving. Like, what do people need to thrive following homelessness? And I'll kind of go in, as I go into the presentation, I'll talk with you about, why I'm kind of asking this question. Often, I'll tell you a little bit now, and then, I'll kind of flesh it out over the presentation. So often, when we're supporting people who are experiencing homelessness, we're often talking about, what they need to, to secure an apartment and to keep the apartment. And when you talk with community services, that's kind of their focus. Those are their metrics. That's what they brag about. They say, we've housed, 30 people this month, and they've been housed for more nights and that sort of thing. And that's exactly what we need to do. We need to make sure that people, when they're experiencing homelessness, that they move into housing, and that they keep that housing. But less often, we're looking at kind of aspects of their well-being. So we're less often looking at things like community integration, substance use, mental illness, and those kinds of things. So we're most often concerned about, getting people an apartment and inside of four walls. But once we're in those four walls, it's almost like a lot of community services tend to kind of exit at that point. And sometimes people end up languishing in their housing rather than doing better than what we think, than what we hope for. So I tend to think of just helping a person to become housed as kind of a low bar, that we should be targeting, helping a person becoming housed, but then we should also be asking, what is it that they need to thrive in their communities? And so that's why I'm presenting on this, and I'll talk with you about how I kind of came to that idea of, talking about this more and more. So I'll start by talking about, I'll provide some, statistics related to homelessness in Canada. I'll talk about of individuals who experience homelessness. I'll talk about models aimed at supporting the transition from homeless to housed and their outcomes. In particular, I'll mention Housing First. I'll talk about how service providers might improve outcomes following homelessness. And I'm, speaking to you as a group of people who will go on and practice in the community, or who are already practicing in the community. I'm hoping that what I suggest today you'll remember some of it if you're practicing with individuals who experience homelessness. And then I'll provide some resources to guide research and practice if you're engaged in research and if you're interested in research, and also that you can incorporate into your practice. I should probably say, health professionals, some health professionals, their job is to work with individuals who experience homelessness. But then, sometimes we're in roles where we just meet people who experience homelessness on a regular basis. So an example of that would be, the corrections system, the forensic system, community mental health. If you're working in an inpatient psychiatric unit, you will almost certainly meet people who experience homelessness. And they're encountering you along their journey. And if you're thinking about, how you might kind of pick away at this idea of supporting a person to thrive, there are little things that you can do in those roles that will help to promote that for people who have lived experience of homelessness. So at least 235,000 people experience homelessness in Canada in a given year, and this is costing the Canadian economy over $7 billion per annum. So that was a statistic that was pulled together by some economists in Calgary, and that was prior to 2014. So it's the cost, and that cost is actually accounts for criminal justice involvement, involvement with the healthcare system, the cost of shelter and services associated with homelessness. So that's a pretty big ticket item in the Canadian economy. That 235,000, we know that homelessness is growing in Canada. It's actually not, despite all of our efforts, it continues to grow. And that number, that 235,000, is actually quite a low estimate because our primary method for counting individuals who experience homelessness is something called a point in time count, where we literally go out onto the street and we try to find people who experience homelessness. And we go into shelters and we talk with people that we know are homeless, but there are many people that we'll never see if we send out a bunch of volunteers into the community and they're walking around and trying to identify who's homeless. It's stigmatizing. So if you are a person who's counting people, if you walk up to somebody that you think is experiencing homelessness, they may not tell you that they're homeless. And so know that there's a whole host of reasons why this 235,000 is likely a low estimate. We know that chronic homelessness is a growing population, and it's a population that, we know that people who, when they become homeless, they tend to be homeless for longer. And this is primarily because in many high-income countries worldwide, there's a growing gap between rich and poor. There are very few people in the middle class, fewer and fewer people in the middle class in high-income countries. And this is why we're seeing homelessness growing in multiple high-income countries worldwide. There's some key populations that we know, require particular types of supports in Canada. There's some populations that are growing in Canada, in particular youth, families, women, older persons are all growing in the homeless population. And those are populations of people that we tended to protect in society, and now they're people who are falling through the cracks. Although Indigenous persons represent, about 5% of the Canadian population, actually 4.3% of the Canadian population is one estimate, they represent 24 to 30% of the homeless population. So you kind of, you see these kind of these inequities that when you look at the statistics on homelessness. So this is kind of the Canadian definition of homelessness that researchers tend to use and that community services tend to use. And I'm just going to read it out to you because it has a couple of really important elements. So homelessness describes the situation of an individual or family without stable, permanent, appropriate housing or the immediate prospect, means, and ability of acquiring it. It's the result of systemic or societal barriers, a lack of affordable and appropriate housing, the individual or household financial, mental, cognitive, behavioral, or physical challenges, and/or racism and discrimination. Most people do not choose to be homeless, and the experience is generally negative, unpleasant, stressful, and distressing. And there are a few elements of this definition that I really like. First of all, it recognizes that homelessness is, includes things like couch surfing. It includes staying in a shelter. It includes sleeping directly on the street. It also acknowledges that homelessness relates to disability. So we know that individuals who are experiencing homelessness have lived with multiple health conditions often, and I'll tell you more about that. And often it's not just one, health condition; it's several health conditions layered over top of one another. And sometimes, the disabilities that emerge as a result of those health conditions are the reason for a person's homelessness. They're not getting the right kinds of support and they lose their housing. We also know that when people become homeless, that they're actually they're more likely to develop health conditions because of the indignities that they face in their daily lives and the conditions that they're living in. The other thing that I really like about this definition, and this is kind of my public service message because I hear it all the time, when people say, people choose to be homeless, some people choose to be homeless. And I literally, I didn't actually tell you too much about my background, but my research is in the area of homelessness and mental health. I also worked clinically as an occupational therapist for over 10 years. And I worked primarily in community mental health. And I worked in a shelter for 7.5 years. So I've worked in a low barrier shelter for 7.5 years. And I've met a lot of people who experience homelessness, both in my research, working in a shelter, and in community mental health. And I can tell you that not a single person of, all of those people that I've known for years, not a single person chose to be homeless. They became homeless because of a whole bunch of bad luck, and because they were living with often health conditions that led to their homelessness and led to them living in poverty. Because we're not providing the right kinds of supports for people in Canadian society, even though we have the resources for it. So often when people tell you that they choose to be homeless, it's often kind of a sometimes a defensive reaction. And when you dig a little bit deeper and talk with them a bit more about being housed, you find out that that's what they want more than anything. So, okay. Just to give you a bit of language around homelessness, we talk about, the homeless population in Canada. The least common type of homelessness in Canada is long-term homelessness. We call that chronic homelessness. And that form, that's often defined as having been homeless continuously or being unhoused continuously for 1 year or 4 times in the last 3 years. The episodic homelessness is when that's the second most common type of homelessness. And that's when a person is homeless and then they become housed, and then they lose their housing again, and then they become housed again repeatedly. And then there's transitional homelessness. So this is a group of people who, they encounter some bad luck. Usually, they lose a job or have, losses of people in their lives. It's stressful. Things are really challenging for them, and then they lose their housing, they become housed again, and they're not homeless after that. So that's the majority of people who experience homelessness in Canada. But we know that the most expensive form of homelessness, and the type that actually is more closely associated with poor physical and mental well-being, is chronic homelessness. There are a number of different conditions we know to be quite common in the homeless population. There's, mental illness has long been associated with homelessness. And lesser known is that the traumatic brain injury in the homeless population. There was one really interesting study where researchers went into a shelter in Toronto. I believe it was Seton House, which is a rather large hospital in downtown Toronto. Not hospital, shelter in downtown Toronto. And they took a convenience sample, and what they found is that 53% of people that they sampled had a positive history for traumatic brain injury. And what we know is that when people experience homelessness, they're more likely to sustain a traumatic brain injury once they're homeless. This is a interesting study that was published in The Lancet in 2014. So it's aging a bit, but it's a really, really helpful study. It was a systematic review of prevalence, looking at different types of health conditions and their prevalence in the homeless population as opposed to the general population. And you can see here on the left, the prevalence in the homeless population of a whole host of different types of health conditions are much higher in the homeless population as opposed to the general population. And of interest, like one kind of really interesting thing that we never really talk about is that suicide is a leading cause of mortality among homeless persons. And I would venture to say that's because, they're living in a state of extreme social exclusion and often don't have the supports that they need to be well or to thrive. These are some infectious diseases that tend to be quite common in the homeless population. When I worked in a shelter, I knew that, approximately 30% of people who were in the shelter at any given time were hepatitis B positive. So I was always really careful about trying not to transmit viruses in the shelter and trying not to take one on myself. Things like body louse, Bartonella quintana, which is like a bacteria associated with body louse, is actually quite prevalent in the homeless population compared with the general population. I don't think I've known a single person who has body louse. but when you're living in, these kind of close quarters and unclean living conditions, that can tend to emerge. And just to, not to drive the point too deeply, but you can see here that there are a bunch of different chronic health conditions that are quite common in the homeless population. One thing that might surprise you here, that is in Canada, 46% of people who experience homelessness in Canada, who are homeless, actually are obese or overweight. And you'd think, oh, well, why is that the case? It would probably be difficult to find food. In fact, it's cheap food is actually causes you to gain weight. And so things like, refined carbohydrates and that sort of thing. So often food insecurity is defined as not having access to enough nutritious food. And so that's why you would see this here. Also, there are certain, I could go into that a little bit more, but I won't. There are a couple of different support models that are used to support people who experience homelessness. And in the past, we had this model called the treatment first model, which was really about making sure that people had, that they had their addictions treated, that their mental illness was well managed, and that physical health problems were managed before they found housing. And the idea behind that was that, they would be more likely to keep their housing if their health was better. So let's just provide wraparound supports while the person is experiencing homelessness, and we're going to help them to be well so that they're in a better position when they're housed. And that kind of went on for a really long time. And so it kind of emphasized the use of shelters, the medical model, looking at homelessness as an individual problem. And also, transitional housing. So providing housing that would help a person to try out living independently before they moved into their own independent housing. But then, some researchers in New York City with an organization called Pathways to Housing came along and said, that's ridiculous. We shouldn't be doing this anymore. How can a person be well without housing? And so we invented the housing first model, which is let's make sure that the person is housed, and then we can kind of provide wraparound supports and help them to manage their health problems afterward. And this approach is kind of the going model now. And it emphasizes, the use of supportive housing. So providing housing immediately and making sure that people have the right supports in that housing early on. And what we know about this approach, there was actually the largest randomized controlled trial of housing first, which is this approach in the world, was actually conducted in Canada by a bunch of researchers in 5 different Canadian cities. And what they found, and it was a very large sample, this is a very large sample for a randomized controlled trial. And what they found is that, using housing first helped the system to save money. It showed that housing first was feasible to implement. It helped people to secure and to sustain their housing for longer periods, and it improved quality of life. So there's a whole bunch of studies out there that demonstrate exactly this. And so housing first is kind of the going model. Since this study, a whole bunch of housing first programs have been implemented across Canada. And I would be shocked to hear that there was a community that was not implementing housing first. This is has been strongly embraced in the housing and homelessness sector. And it, in my opinion, is exactly what we need to do. But when you look more closely at the literature on housing first, what you find is that, yes, it's good at helping to improve quality of life, but it's not so great at helping to address symptoms of mental illness. Often people move into housing, they use more than they did before. They talk about how they're not integrated in their communities. This comes out in qualitative literature, and it comes out in quantitative literature. They often talk about being lonely. They talk about how they want to be employed, but they often aren't. So about 80% of people say that they want to be employed, but they're not receiving the supports to be employed, or they're not able to secure employment on their own. And this is really important because if they're living in poverty, which is really the reason people become homeless in the first place, employment provides an opportunity for improving a person's income. And we know that employment is associated with better well-being. And then engagement in meaningful activity, which sounds like it's a minor issue, but when you kind of dig into the literature around how important it is for most of us to engage in meaningful activity and how it impacts on our mental well-being, it's quite powerful. And so I've actually conducted literature on exactly this topic, and in particular focused on boredom. So I'll tell you a little bit about that, which sounds like it's such a minor issue, boredom, big deal. But when you talk with people about boredom, people who experience boredom pervasively in their lives, it's you realize how important an issue it is. So, knowing all of this, I kind of thought, I need to kind of dig into all of these areas a little bit more. So my research program now is kind of focused on, looking at all of these different outcomes and trying to identify how we can help people to thrive following homelessness. So we conducted a systematic review to look at the effectiveness of interventions targeting community integration among individuals who are experiencing homelessness. And so this was a systematic review. It was just published this year. And what we found in this study was that Housing First demonstrated very poor effectiveness for promoting community integration. Just to give you a sense of what this chart is all about, so this table is all about, it breaks down the topic or the construct of community integration into three different components. The first is, and it's based on a Wong and Solomon's definition of community integration, if any of you know what that is. But they break down community integration into three different components. The first is physical integration, or spending time in one's community outside of one's apartment. So that's this part. Social integration is having social networks, knowing people in your community. And psychological integration is having a sense of belonging in one's community. And so the diamonds here show that this is mixed effectiveness. The circles show that there was the intervention wasn't effective, and this filled in circle here shows that there was that the intervention was found by the researchers to be effective. So if you look at Housing First, it's just one study demonstrates that it was effective for promoting a sense of belonging in one's community. And those were just the Housing First interventions. But what's really interesting is when we looked at psychosocial interventions, in particular, the ones that included peer support, there's a whole bunch, you see a whole bunch of interventions that demonstrated effectiveness. Not a whole bunch, because there were only 21 studies that were included, and only a couple of studies looking at employment. So that told me definitely that that's something that we need to do. So then we thought, okay, well, what about this employment piece? So we conducted a systematic review that we're in the process of writing up right now, where we were looking at, what interventions have targeted employment and what kind of outcomes are they associated with. And what we found is that there were only 13 studies that evaluated the effectiveness of employment interventions with individuals who were experiencing homelessness. And they included, these interventions. So supported employment, combined substance use and vocational supports, and then integrated services that include an employment component. And then there was a vocational skills training intervention that combined cognitive behavioral therapy. So not a lot of interventions here, and they all of them collectively demonstrated a low to moderate degree of effectiveness on employment outcomes. So that's kind of that was another way of sort of picking at those outcomes. Then, I conducted a pilot study a few years ago looking at boredom and its associations with mental well-being among individuals who were experiencing homelessness. And we had some really powerful findings there with people, the participants telling us that they didn't feel like they existed anymore because they weren't doing anything with their time. They talked about wanting to use substances more because they had these huge pockets of time that were unoccupied. And so that gave us enough sort of evidence to conduct a larger review. So we conducted a larger study. So we conducted a study with 164 participants. It was supposed to be larger, but then we were cut off because of COVID. We were supposed to recruit over 300 participants, but COVID has been affecting everyone. And we interviewed people who were both unhoused and people who were housed. And what we wanted to know is, A, what is their experience of boredom? and also B, does it change after a person becomes housed? So this is just sort of the demographic distribution of the participants. When we use a number of different standardized measures to look at boredom and meaningful activity engagement and how they were associated with mental well-being. And so then we separated the two groups, so people who were unhoused and people who were housed, and we tried to see if there were any significant differences among the participants on indices of boredom and meaningful activity engagement, and also mental well-being. And what we found was that in terms of boredom, there was no difference between the group of people who were homeless and the group of people who were housed on measures of boredom. So this idea that people are better off when they're housed doesn't necessarily hold. When we looked at engagement and meaningful activity, people who were housed were not more likely to be engaged in meaningful activity. So they were engaged in the same degree of meaningful activity that they were when they were unhoused. In terms of hopelessness, there was actually no difference between people who were unhoused and people who were housed on a measure of hopelessness. There was no difference on mental well-being either. No difference on alcohol and drug use, and no difference on community integration. So this idea that like people are better off when they're housed is not necessarily the case. And so what this tells me is that we need to provide better supports when people are housed following homelessness to help to target these outcomes a little bit more effectively. Some of the qualitative findings, the basic idea here is that, the unhoused group and the housed group talked about boredom in exactly the same way. They talked about how there were all sorts of things in their environment that impacted on their ability to engage in activities that were meaningful. And they talked about how it was like being in jail while they were unhoused. People who were housed talked about boredom being pervasive in their lives, and they talked about how the primary essence of this data was that the participants talked about how they were felt alone and that they weren't able to engage in the world. And one participant told us that boredom was like being in the center of a tornado, that it's everything's still in the center of a tornado, but everything in the world is kind of moving around you. So that was what that was about. So then we kind of took this knowledge and thought, okay, well, what do we need to do now with all of this information? And so we submitted a CHR grant application and got some funding to identify what is needed for people to thrive following homelessness, and how can we create a model that will more effectively support people once they've left homelessness. And so, we're actually working on this study both in Kingston and in London. And so we're working with community stakeholders. It's a community-based participatory research study. So we're actually working alongside community stakeholders to collect data and then to identify a model that will more effectively support people following homelessness. So right now we're in the throes of interviewing individuals with lived experience, and we've interviewed a number of different health and social care providers. And once we analyze that data, then we're moving into developing a model alongside community stakeholders, including individuals with lived experience. This study actually has photo elicitation components. So we're actually interviewing people with lived experiences of homelessness, and then we're giving them cameras and asking them to go out into the world and take photos of what they think they need to thrive once they're housed. And so we're interviewing people who are both housed and unhoused, knowing that they're people who have often flitted in and out of homelessness. So they know what it's like to be housed, they know what it's like to be unhoused. And so these are just two participants from Kingston that like we interviewed them, I think this person 2 weeks ago. And he called himself Matt, so that's not his real name. But the way that he described this to us is that he's currently living in a shelter, and he said that he thinks about his father all the time. And he thinks about how he and his father went boating together all of the time. And the picture on the left-hand side is taken down at the Kingston waterfront. And he said, I could just his father had died. And he said, I could just end my life if I wanted and just jump into this water. It's freezing cold right now. And I could be with my dad in the water like we always were, but I'm choosing not to. And that was the picture on the left-hand side. And he talked about how he needed to be out of this situation of experiencing homelessness because he was afraid that if he was there for too long, that he was going to become like everyone else that he met while he was experiencing homelessness. That's how he termed it. That's not mine. Those aren't my words. Those are his words. So in the middle, he took this picture of a skull, and he said, I'm not going to live. I'm sure I'm not going to live if I stay homeless for much longer. And then on the right-hand side, there was pictures of, this is actually a crystal meth pipe, and he said, everyone that I know is smoking crystal meth, and I'm probably going to become just like them. And so there was this fear in him that he was going to descend into something that he didn't want to be. Another person that we interviewed, the person who was housed, he called himself Pico. In the middle picture, he had just been housed, and in the on the right-hand side is actually a picture of his encampment. So he actually returned to his encampment and took a picture of a place that he had constructed in the woods. And he said that he misses it there all the time, and especially because the place that he is living in right now, which is the place in the center, the center picture, that's a picture of the inside of his apartment. And he said, it's dirty, and he's paying way too much rent for what he was paying $1,200 for rent. And the place was like, he showed us a bunch of pictures of how poor quality his housing was. And he was living with a roommate that he didn't get along with. And he said, I'm just kind of hanging on all the time. I just want to go back to the encampment to live in the woods and be there, because where I'm living right now is not actually helping my mental well-being. And all I want is, and that's the picture on the left-hand side, he said, I just want a beautiful place to live. Like, I want a place that's fresh and clean and just like everybody else wants. So this was kind of, he was really struggling while he was housed to stay there. And in fact, during the interview, he said that this encampment, it was locked up in, there's a door and it was locked. And he was so afraid that he was going to go back that he actually gave the key to a young couple, because he figured that if they moved in, he wouldn't be able to go back, and that would prevent him from living out on the street again. So, just what I'm, trying to say here is that not everybody, just because they're housed, it doesn't mean that people that feel like they're always better off. Do I think they're better off? Absolutely. I think people are better off when they're housed. But are they thriving? Not necessarily. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here. So what do I think, based on my experience and spending a lot of time doing all of this work, is what do I think health professionals or service providers need to do to support thriving following homelessness? Well, I think, I'm an occupational therapist and I love my profession. And I think what we do is pretty important. And, one of the things that what occupational therapists do is we look at how people spend their time and how it influences their mental well-being, whether they're able to function in their daily activities, whether they're able to participate in what is meaningful for them. And that's not always happening. It's actually written into documents around related to housing and homelessness programs, but it's actually not very well targeted by existing services. And there's a lot of evidence actually to suggest that engagement in meaningful activity is very facilitative of mental well-being. So I think we need to kind of, take this a little bit more seriously. I also think we need to find ways to connect people with their people. So this is kind of my way of saying that I think we need to help people to integrate in their communities. Often people become housed and they talk about being lonely. They end up being cut off from the community that they were homeless with. And then they're isolated in their apartments. And I could tell you multiple stories of people that I know who have actually foregone their housing because they wanted to be with other people, and when they moved into their housing, nobody came to visit them, and they didn't feel like they could invite people over to their apartment. So if we can connect people with their people, then I think that's something that we can do to help to promote the health of individuals who are experiencing homelessness. I think we can advocate for reforms to address poverty among individuals living with disabilities. If you kind of go back to early on, and I was sharing with you the prevalence of these different types of health conditions. Um, you know, uh, we know that in Canada, individuals who are living with disabilities are much more likely to live in poverty. And we also know that health conditions in the homeless population tend to be much more prevalent in those in the general population. So there's this intimate relationship between disability and poverty that we need to address in Canada and many countries worldwide. Um, and then I think we need to obviously, and this could have been point one, but advocate for improved access to affordable housing. And that's often where we talk about, providing access to just affordable housing, but it should be good quality housing. In the interviews that we're conducting right now with individuals with lived experience of homelessness, they're talking about how they're housed in some pretty awful places. And they talk about how the shelter and the street were better places for them to live. So we need to advocate not just for affordable housing, but good quality affordable housing. The other thing I'm kind of pretty passionate about is peer support, and I don't think we do it often enough in the housing and homelessness sector. So, just going back to this point of connecting people with their people, this number 2 point, one way of doing that is actually employing people with lived experience to help um, to um, to speak to their own lived experience, and they might actually have a better way of helping people to find a way into community. So not that the peer support workers themselves are going to be paid to be friends with people with lived experience of homelessness and mental illness, but rather that that they might have a greater likelihood of scaffolding this relationship. And so if you look at that, like I shared with you the findings from that community integration review, a lot of the interventions that incorporated peer support were associated with greater greater effectiveness in terms of community aspects of community integration. So that's my kind of call out to peer support. And it's exactly why I incorporate individuals with lived experience in my lab as staff. So they are, I have, actually 3 people now who are working in my lab who have lived experience of homelessness. And they regularly consult with me on different aspects of research projects. They're collaborators and co-investigators on research projects that I'm leading. And they're, I can't possibly replace them with anyone else. So, so giving people opportunities and actually drawing, they went to the School of Life, and it's not something that I have the experience of. And so if we can incorporate, this is one way that individuals with lived experience can find their way into community. I'm huge. I'm talking often about universal basic income. If we are going to address poverty among individuals with disabilities, then one way that we can do that is actually identifying what a livable income is and making sure that everybody's income never surpasses, it never goes below that, rather. And so if you don't know what universal basic income is, this is a really lovely video. It's a great primer on what universal basic income is from an economic perspective. So it's quite neutral, and I like this video. We can do more, I think, to help people find ways into employment. And one way is actually through social enterprise. So this is actually an example of a social enterprise where people with lived experience have been given jobs, and like as baristas. It's in London, England, and it's called Change Please. And they sell coffee for the same price that Starbucks does, and it gives people jobs in the city of London. And I believe this is growing. So this is just one example of the kinds of things that we can do to help people who have lived experiences of homelessness, have lives like all of us have. If you want to know more about homelessness in Canada, this is getting a bit dated. It's called The State of Homelessness in Canada. It was published every year for a few years by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. But I think they were funded for a certain period of time, and then their funding ended. So the last edition of this was 2016, but it's still informative and still current. And if you're interested in that systematic review on health conditions among homeless individuals, then you can access the article on the right-hand side, the Faisal article, which I reference all the time, but it's a great study that just kind of calls out how prevalent health conditions are among individuals who are experiencing homelessness. If you want to know more about Housing First and also maybe hear the stories of individuals who experience homelessness, this was actually a film documentary project that was part of the At Home Chez Soi project, which was the study that I talked about before on Housing First, the randomized controlled trial of Housing First. And if you follow this link, there are actually a whole bunch of videos of individuals with lived experience of homelessness telling their stories of how, their experience of being housed following homelessness in kind of a film form. If you're an OT or an OT student, I figured that there would be some here today. This year, we, myself and a group of other occupational therapy researchers created a framework to guide the practice of occupational therapists who are supporting individuals across the trajectory of homeless to housed. And it's freely available for your use. And I've provided the link here. So we've been kind of doing a bit of a roadshow, sharing it with people. So that's that. And if you want to contact me, this is kind of my contact information. My lab is called the Social Justice and Mental Health Research Lab at Western. And the website's here. It's a work in progress. I am one of my research assistants is helping me to make it beautiful and have all of the relevant up-to-date information on it. But it does have some information about who's in my lab and kind of who, and kind of some of the projects that we're working on. And you can email me at my email address, or if you're on Twitter, then you can kind of follow me on Twitter or get me to follow you on Twitter or whatever works best for you. So that's what I had today. So hopefully it wasn't too, yeah, I was hoping that we would have some time for some questions at the end.
Hi, Dr. Marshall.
Mm-hmm.
Just want to say thank you very, very much for that wonderful presentation. Very eye-opening.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me.
So I think, oh, go for it. I was just going to open the floor for any questions.
I was just wondering if you're able to post the slides. There's some resources there that would be nice to access.
Sure, yeah. So I will actually share them in the chat right now in PDF format, but the links should all work. So I'll share it right now. It'll load on a moment. It's pretty visual, so it'll probably take a minute to load.
Thanks so much, Dr. Marshall.
You're welcome.
Are there any questions?
We have someone from the chat, Sarah, saying we use this framework to guide a project last semester.
Okay.
And a few thank yous here and there.
I have a question.
And what,
if you don't mind.
What was the? Oh yeah, go ahead, Tessa. Is that?
So I actually I'm an OT student, and I did my first placement at KFHC, which Kingston Pontiac Housing Corporation, social housing, which I'm pretty sure you used to be the face after us.
Yeah, with Fiona. Yeah.
So obviously learned a lot about this. But I was wondering if because you mentioned that obviously there's not enough support once somebody who is unhoused then has housing. And so social housing is a really good, or a prime example of that. And so I was wondering if you had any ideas of what specifically it's in an ideal world, what you would like to see in social housing, on-site support from healthcare providers, or more community connections, or just your perspectives on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of worms social housing. So it's interesting because in Kingston, there's no what we call a homeless priority. And so the wait lists for social housing in Canada, they're like, in 2016 or something, there were 185,000 people on social housing wait lists across the province. And they're on those wait lists for like 7 to 10 years. Like it's a ridiculous, there isn't enough social housing for to meet demand. And in London, there is a homeless priority. So people actually move right from shelters right into social housing. And that doesn't happen in Kingston at all. Often people go for long periods experiencing homelessness before because they go on the wait list like everyone else. And because Kingston has a very low vacancy rate, meaning that the number of apartments that are available for rent are very few. It's one of the lowest vacancy rates in Canada, actually. Then we have the situation where people are experiencing homelessness in a prolonged degree. So by the time people, if they move into social housing, and if they don't, regardless, they've usually been homeless for a long period of time. And according to Housing First is supposed to be time unlimited. So you should be providing supports for a long period of time. But what often happens is that in the interest of managing resources, the services that provide Housing First are not supporting people for long enough. Might support them for 3 months at a time, and then they fall off the radar. And some people need to be supported for 3 or 4 or 5 years or more. And when I, in my research, when I talk with people about the transition from homeless to housed, they talk about how, they didn't even start to feel settled in their housing until like the 2 or 3 year mark. So it takes a long time. And so if you're homeless for a longer period of time, by the time you become housed, it takes you 2 or 3, like the longer you've been homeless, it's probably going to take longer for you to adjust to being housed. And so that was a long-winded way of saying that I think people need to be housed for, they need to be supported for a lot longer after they're housed. I also think there's a tendency, community services are managing, sometimes very, very complex situations. And so, sometimes they're not seeing people in the interest of managing resources. They're not always seeing people in their homes. Sometimes they meet them in the community. They never see them in their apartments. They don't always see how they're functioning. And in the social housing context, sometimes things will start to fall apart in their housing, and a community worker has no idea that things are falling apart to that degree because they haven't seen them in their apartment. And so I would sort of encourage health professionals, if they can, to see people in the community as much as possible. So does that answer your question? That's just a couple, I guess. Yeah. Oh, Tessa, yeah. You're on mute.
Oh, yes, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Like there's more, I think there's more to it than that, but those are a couple, I think, of big parts of it that I think are not always happening. Any other questions? I have, by the way, shared the presentation in the chat. So if you should see it by now. Do you see it there now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. Okay. Does anybody have experience working with individuals who are experiencing homelessness? Tessa, it sounds like you have some from social housing, but others?
I think we talked briefly before the talk, but I used to work in mental health and suicide response, which meant that a large population of our clients were experiencing homelessness. And part of our relief for that in London was the relief beds through CMHA.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, I mean, that's a really nice example of how, you may not work directly in the area of homelessness, but you're working with people who experience homelessness. Like if you work in an ER, you're going to see people who experience homelessness all the time, even though it's not a role that's specifically dedicated to homeless population. And Rachel was saying that you've worked in shelters as well. so there's at least another person who's worked in shelters.
I also have some experience. My first placement was with an ACT team in Newfoundland. So a large majority of our clients were actually homeless, homeless and housed. Yeah.
And what is your professional background, Sarah?
I'm in OT.
Oh, you're an OT. Okay, yeah. So I often say like OTs have been working with people who experience homelessness for many years, and then people kind of raise their eyebrows, and then I give them examples like ACT. Community mental health, inpatient mental health, crisis services, that sort of thing.
It was interesting too because our placement was in January and February, so the Newfoundland winters are pretty harsh, and there was times we get phone calls like we were going to leave in like an hour's time, and someone didn't have anywhere to stay that night, and we're like, okay, well, it's a snowstorm, we're getting 30 centimeters, what are we going to do? And there's no lineup for service. I don't know if you know that there's no lineup for service beds in Newfoundland. It's all like arranged shelters.
Okay, so somebody calls a number and then they end up being placed. Okay, interesting.
Everyone's placed. Also, I think you were going to ask, I was the one who said we used your framework for our project.
Okay.
It was just it was OT process project. So we had to go through the OT process, and we had to pick a movie and then pick a character. So we did Will Smith's character in Pursuit of Happiness, and then used it. Yeah.
And what class was that?
It was for OT models and practice.
Okay.
Kind of like our theory course. Yeah.
Interesting.
But thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to take your attention to the chat. I linked a feedback form there. It'll really help inform future speaker series events. And once again, I really want to thank Dr. Marshall for coming in. And thank you guys for coming in to join us. But yeah, I just wanted to take your attention to that feedback form if you haven't seen it already.
Thank you very much for having me. And if anybody has questions after the session that kind of percolate for you, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer email. Thank you.
Oh, just before we have lots of people jumping off the call, I also wanted to bring your attention to the chat to the KHealth website. So in case you don't know, KHealth is an interdisciplinary student organization. So obviously we just had a wonderful chat from a researcher and OT. Last month we had a nursing representative give a talk. And we also partner with medicine and physical therapy. So amongst all of these student programs, we offer an interprofessional community health program where we are trying to educate individuals in how we can provide collaborative healthcare. So if you check out the link to our website, you can read more about our program and potential certificate. And we hope that we see you at future talks.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice night.
Thanks again, Dr. Marshall. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.